On opening government, we say that history has become too classist. We say that history has become centered around the elite in such a way that stories are not being told in an accurate manner. We say that in the status quo, curricula does not have the ability to tell the stories of individual groups in a way which is accurate. It's for these reasons why we are so proud to propose. We have 2 points of framing that we would like to begin with in order to make sure that we're all on the same page. First, we want to point out the word structured around. Because the motion gives us this word structured around, we believe that we are not burdened today that we do not look at leaders or like icons and movements at all. However, we see that the central point, the central focus of all of our history curricula should be on the stories of individuals and the lives of those people rather than on the icons. So what does this look like? This looks like the introduction to your history course. The first classes you are taking are exclusively talking about like anecdotal stories of individuals. You're looking at letters and primary sources from soldiers in the Civil War and writing home to their family. This looks like people who are in the civil rights protests, looking at interviews directly with them in news sources, etc., rather than looking at like the lives of MLK or the lives of Gandhi. We see that this is better because it increases the accuracy of our history, a more accurate portrayal, because we aren't just looking at the elites of society, that we're able to win praise on those grounds. And we also say that this is more principally just because we are allowing the stories that deserve to be told, the stories that are unheard, to be told first and foremost in our history curricula. We have 2 substantives to talk about why specifically this is good and a requirement for us to have just curricula in the status quo. We see our first substantive of individual idealization. Specifically, we see 2 principal modes of looking at this idea. First, when we look at immoral actors. By definition, when we look at what the opposition must defend, what they must advocate for, they have to advocate for putting these individuals on a pedestal. When we structure around our curricula around these individual actors, we by definition put them on a pedestal. This looks like focusing on the life of George Washington and including all the things that he has done. And we believe that is detrimental. Why? Because it minimizes the wrongs that those actors have done. It means that we do not look at what George Washington did during his life, and we focus a lot more on the accomplishments because that's how we get the clear line and story of history. We fail on the opposition side of the house, we fail to get to those nuances because when we structure our history curricula around individuals in an attempt to tell a story, we don't have space for that nuance. We don't have space to not put these people on a pedestal, because whenever we introduce a story of the Civil War, of the American War for Independence, whenever we start that discussion around an individual, we are always going to be putting that individual on a pedestal. I'll take OO before I continue.
Yes, could you please just further flesh out how exactly putting these individuals in the spotlight where we can both critique and engage with them necessarily places them on a pedestal and in a positive context?
Well, we already see in the status quo how these individuals are not getting critiqued. At the very least, not in popular spaces. It might be being done in the niches of academia, but for young children who are just learning history for the first time, they're, number one, don't have the cognitive ability in most cases to grasp those nuances. And number 2, we don't have the ability overall to keep the conversation around like the bad things that those individuals have done and still teach history. So we say on both levels, we do better on our side of the house. Second, when we look to moral actors who led positive movements, we see that we still minimize the wrongs those individuals have done. Look at Gandhi in India and his methods. While we believe that Gandhi was a very good person on balance, he also did very immoral things like sleeping with young girls and cheating on his wife. When we put Gandhi on a pedestal, we minimize the victims that he the people that he victimized in his life. And that too is detrimental, and we think that's wrong. Instead of focusing on the lives of individuals and focusing our history around that, we say on government that we should be instead looking at individuals so we can get a more holistic idea of what these groups look like. And that's where we move into our second substantive, that of how we better discuss groups on our side of the house. On our side of the house, we look at more stories and we look at a wider number of stories. This means that no individual in these movements is being put on a pedestal. It instead means that a large group of individuals are being put forth for study in our history curricula. This means that we're getting the lives of not just the elite in movements, not just the George Washington, but also we get to see the soldier that's not getting paid during the American War for Independence, and how that is affecting his life and the life of his family. Because of that, we say that we have a better understanding of history on our side of the house. And that's our primary impact here of education. We gain multiple perspectives when we look at multiple individuals, ordinary individuals, and their lives. For example, another example of this we see is the bus boycotts that occurred during the civil rights movement. 5 different women had refused to give up their seat on a bus, yet those women did not get the spotlight because they had individual things wrong with them. What we allowed to do on our side of the house is get a full understanding of what these movements look like. And by extension, we become less elite and we teach a less elitist form of history than we see with opposition. They must defend on their side of the house the idea that we should be putting the elite on a pedestal and that is beneficial on educational grounds. We instead, on their side of the house, give a watered down style of history that is detrimental to these movements and the understanding of them. On principle, we say that these stories deserve to be told. We think that we should not be telling the story of George Washington without the story of those individual soldiers. We should not be telling the story of MLK without those people who individually contributed to that protest. We are so proud to propose.
Cool, thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition up to begin the case for the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. In that case, I will be starting now. All right then. So I think that one thing that's very important to point out at the very top of my speech, right, is just that he's putting forth this idea that we have to defend like putting these individuals on pedestals, that we have to defend like absolutely worshiping them and things along those lines, right? Treating them as if they've done nothing wrong, except that is quite literally not what the opposition side has to defend. What we're defending in this debate today is putting the spotlight on these individuals, on these like extremely affluent, on these extremely like iconic individuals in history, and like using them as the focal point that we contextualize and that we view history through, okay? And we think that that is actually the best model for viewing history. And to explain that to you, I'm going to give 3 points of positive matter. The first being on contextualizing major events, the second being on critiquing our framers, and the third being on being called minority assent. But before I do that, I'd like to get into a little bit of rebuttal in what they brought us in their case, right? So first off, they brought up this idea that like history, like by focusing on these individuals is inherently inaccurate, except like I'm just not sure that that's true, right? Like we are capable of like teaching history fully and teaching like everything that like these individuals did. The reason that like it isn't taught in the status quo is because like countries, when they're teaching these their children, want to be like a bit nationalistic and like paint a good image of like the people that have been their countries. And we just don't think that that changes on their side of the house. As we clearly see in examples like Nazi Germany, where they would give anecdotal stories of like really exceptional individuals from and in their country, right? And we just think that that harm is bitten by both sides of this debate. And if we want more accurate history, we could simply advocate for like schools and for education systems, educating people fully on what individuals that the history is focusing on did in their lifetimes. Second of all, I'd like to bring up the fact that like he says that inherently putting these people here like minimizes their wrongs, right? It minimizes everything we've done wrong, except like saying that is as if we're only focusing on like heroes or only focusing on people who did like really big positive things throughout history, right? Except like we quite literally like study like terrorists, study like people who committed genocide, study like terrible people in history. So like to say that like we're inherently like worshiping and like treating these people like they're like, you know, saints, things along those lines is totally ridiculous. Then next of all, he's talking about discussing groups. And obviously we believe that like this like framework that's says that MLK isn't one of the most important things when talking about the civil rights movement, or saying that like other leaders aren't the most important things when talking about these movements, is a bit flawed, but we're going to get more into that in our points about minority ascent. So moving on to our positive material, right? So what exactly did I mean when we're talking about how major events are contextualized? Well, we know that in the status quo, there are people who hold a lot more social and political capital in comparison to the ordinary individual, in comparison to the average person, right? And we know that these people have the unique ability to sway large amounts of people. We see like examples like JP Morgan, who when he went out to increase people's opinions of him, would quite literally hand people nickels and dimes, right? And all of that was just simply like an advertising campaign to just like give people this positive opinion of him, right? Meaning that like in the status quo, in that time, people were swayed by his opinions, swayed by his thoughts because they like thought well of him, right? And while we may think that that's a negative thing in our status quo in the present day, it doesn't change the fact that he did that. And by the fact that he did that, he was able to sway major events and able to change the world around him in ways that the ordinary individual could not, right? Furthermore, we see examples like Karl Marx, like Kwame Nkrumah, like Fanon, who put forth these like really large political and like philosophical ideas when they're alive. And we believe that like it's really important to look at the context of these people's lives and the context under which they wrote these ideas, seeing as these ideas like inspired like revolutions, inspired like revolutionaries, and inspired civil rights activists throughout the world in the time that came after them, right? We believe that these individuals' contributions to history are extremely important and cannot simply be like washed aside and like pushed aside so that we can focus more on like anecdotal evidence, right? We also believe that like focusing on this anecdotal evidence in conjunction with these individuals, as they said, is going to put unnecessary strain on the education system, seeing as we're now going to be splitting our focus by quite a bit in doing this. Furthermore, now I'm going to get into our point on critiquing the framers, right? We have to be able to focus on these individuals, focus on their lives in general, so that we can actually critique the decisions they made and critique the things they did, right? As my partner said in his POI, what we're doing here isn't putting people on a pedestal. We are putting them under the spotlight, and that spotlight can be positive or negative. If we aren't critiquing what these people did, then what is to stop us from like actually repeating the negative actions that they did in their time, right? What's to stop us from like putting forth racist or putting forward like homophobic and dangerous ideologies, right? We can focus on individuals if you want, but those individuals aren't the ones who put forth these like large swaying like political ideologies and like different philosophical ideologies that swayed history in general. Then I want to get on to our final point on minority ascent, but before I do that, I will take CG.
Yeah, so when I'm talking about like the role of like individual people, don't individual people on net like contribute to racism? That is the racism like a normal person experiences is probably more characterized by those in their locale than like some abstract foreign leader.
So that's ridiculous. For one reason, right? Sure, an individual person being racist like is a problem for Black people, right? However, I think that it was said best with the statement, a person wanting to lynch me is their problem. A person having the ability to lynch me is my problem, right? Individuals who have to deal with racism and things along those lines are far more affected by structural racism and the fact that individuals have power over them than they are over like an ordinary individual's opinions, right? Now moving on to my point on minority ascent. So as we know, minority groups oftentimes require like a strong central voice or a strong person to come forward and advocate for them, right? We see this through examples like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and other like prominent civil rights leaders, right? And we believe that like by not focusing on these individuals, as they've quite literally stated, we are one, taking away these people's ability to advocate for themselves. Seeing as lots of the ordinary individuals, as CG brought up, are not going to be listening to like the average Black person or the average minority individual. We need these strong leaders to be focused on history so that people actually look at what they said, look at these ideas they brought up on like the liberation of these minorities, and will actually like focus on helping minority issues. We believe that like ordinary individuals will often, focusing on like ordinary individuals will oftentimes cut out minority individuals, seeing as like lots of the time, an ordinary individual wasn't a slave owner, right? The average American wasn't really affected that much by slavery and things along those lines. But my partner will expand on this more. For these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Cool, thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister up to continue the case for the open and government team. Hear, hear.
Everyone can hear me, correct? Opening opposition dropped all the principal argumentation that Caden gave to you in the Prime Minister's speech. Opening opposition dropped the engagement with the idea that these individuals who might be political icons owe their entire existence to the individual small people who gave them the support that they needed in order to be successful. Their stories, of course, are important, but their stories were not solely made by their own individual actions, but rather the support of people who were on the ground helping them that never get their stories told on the opening opposition. Very proud to propose at that point. I'm going to be doing a few things in this speech. First, I'm going to be going over some defense in our case, breaking it down to the principle and the practical. Second of all, going over this idea about war heroes. With that in mind, let's go over the principled argumentation. This is going to be really important in this debate because opening opposition dropped all principle argumentation that we gave you from the get-go. We gave you two major lenses of the principle. First, we told you that regardless, these individuals deserve to have their stories told. Why is that the case? First, the people who are organizing and going on the ground, for example, in the civil rights movement, don't get their stories told in their history textbooks. But Martin Luther King could not exist without the anecdotal stories of all of these individual people who actually showed up to places like Selma and did their own thing and had their own stories. Martin Luther King did not suffer the same struggles as those who were beaten by police officers. He did not suffer the same struggles as those who were killed by police officers during these protests. We think these individuals sacrificed their lives and sometimes suffered trauma in order to get these movements ahead. Thus, we get no individual reason as to why these individuals who might be more political icons deserve to necessarily have more of a voice in history and more of a say in history than the icon who has like the most reputation. We don't think reputation is necessarily conflated with the sacrifice that you made for this entire group. We're going to make that very clear. But the second reason why we just think it's fair to have these individual stories to be told is because it gives a better picture of the all individual nuanced experiences that every single person might have went through in the war. Being once again, Martin Luther King cannot speak for all Black people during the civil rights movement. Being people like George Washington cannot speak for every single soldier during the Revolutionary War, or Ulysses S. Grant can't speak for every single patriot during the Civil War. We think it's only fair in history and very principle that we provide a level of history that engages with these anecdotal stories that tell the stories of all these kind of individuals. At that point, we think we access a more holistic narrative and a more principally just narrative because we aren't focusing and letting one person speak for the groups of the entire collective. We don't think that would ever be justified. Second reason underneath this is putting immoral actors on a pedestal. Opposition comes up here and tells us, okay, well, we can still critique these immoral actors. First, look at the status quo. This simply is not happening. Of course, opposition can try to advocate for a level in which we structure history to critique these historical actors, but by the very nature of you spending 4 pages on these people, you're somehow putting them up on a pedestal and giving them more exposure. We don't think people who committed these kind of immoral actions deserve to have this much exposure. Why is that the case? Simply being, because they were not the best people, we should not be giving 4 pages of all the good actions they did when they did also heinous things. Insofar as there's far other individuals who held contributions, we don't think it's fully fair to have immoral actors to be like put on these pedestals. Even if you don't buy pedestals happen, exposure does. We should not be giving these people that much of a breath in history to the extent that they did awfully destructive things such as structural violence and pillaging of villages and things like slavery. We think at that point the principle is quite clear. But now to the practical argumentation that we got coming out of the opposition bench, which was the holistic material that we received from their side. Before I go on, are there any points? Okay, Cool. So on the practical argumentation that we got from their side, we got a few things. First, this idea of critiquing the framers. First, we have nothing preventing us on our side from literally giving them like a few paragraphs in history and saying, okay, these are the things that they did good, but these are also the things that they did heinously. What the opposition then needs to come up and prove in their next speech is how necessarily giving them 4 pages gives us a broader room to critique necessarily their harmful actions. What opposition needs to do, second of all, is prove to us as to how these individual people were the sole mechanism to actually be able to critique things like slavery. I'm pretty sure I can find an anecdote from an individual slave master and be able to critique slavery. I'm pretty sure I can find an individual anecdote from someone who was a sexual assault perpetrator and find a way to critique sexual assault. I'm pretty sure I can talk about these ideas in textbooks themselves and deconstruct as to how they are unethical. What opposition then needs to prove in their next speech is how this is the sole mechanism that we have to be able to critique these individuals overall. The second thing we got from their side was this idea about minority assent. They talked to us about these people like MLK, about how like it helps to talk about people like MLK because it helps like the entire movement itself. First of all, Caden gave you structural analysis as to how it actually can help deconstruct the movement. When individuals solely get the spotlight and we only get their story, when we get all the critiques of their immoral actions, it delegitimizes them as people themselves, which means it helps to delegitimize the movement. When you can point out as to how these people are hypocritical and unethical, it makes the entire stance that they took to be unredeemable and simply hypocritical in nature, which means you're less likely to support the movement or less likely to respect the movement fully simply because it's hypocrisy. Before I go on, Hans.
Right, so there's a pretty serious tension right here that he just explained to you, right? First, he's telling you that there's absolutely no critiques when you focus on these kind of like important individuals, but now he's telling you that we focus on what's bad, which delegitimizes good movements, right? Where is the line?
Okay, so I just explained to you as to how like critiques are less likely to fully occur. But the second thing that I put underneath that was when you give these people high exposure and you put them on a pedestal, if they are to receive these critiques, they are the sole face of the movement. So every action they then take is a representation of that movement itself, which is why we can't put these people on pedestals, because when they start to fail, being they represent the face of the movement starts to fail as well. At that point, it gives you a pretty clear picture about how delegitimization is more likely to occur. With that, we're going to segue into our argument about the idea of war heroes. First, we think the idealization for people in history is what leads to the idealization of war itself. When we idolize people like Ulysses S. Grant, when we idolize people like George Washington, or at least give them several pages of the glories that they committed in war, and we spend like some time critiquing them, right? We still think we're putting their actions of war on a pedestal itself. This glorifies people in war and creates war heroes by giving them several pages or chapters, and it aids in the glorification of war and in the concept. Putting these people on a pedestal minimizes the heinous actions in war that they committed because we're giving them more exposure. What we need to really understand the link here is when people see people dramatically put in history books and they get several pages, that exposure, when you give them like some credit for good actions, that exposure means that they're going to get some like level of good reputation in society simply because you gave them exposure and you focus on really, really good things that they did. That means you glorify war, you glorify these war heroes, and you glorify the action of itself. We think at that point, opposition fails. Very proud to propose.
Cool, thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition up to close out the top half of this debate. Here.
Excuse me, am I perfectly audible? Awesome. Give me just 1 second to get my timer set up. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. All right, so I guess the first thing I would like to do with my speech is get in some direct refutation in terms of some of the things that we just heard from the second speaker on the government bench. Then hopefully I will just do my best to paint for you how exactly what we've identified as the clash in this round is and how we've engaged with it. A lot of characterization of our case has been that it doesn't really touch theirs, but we disagree with that. So hopefully I will illuminate some of the ways that it does, and we can have a great debate going forward from here. So getting into some specific refutation, right? I actually want to first identify something that the speaker said almost verbatim, which is the idea that, these individuals are not the best people, so we should ignore them. And we actually believe this feeds right into a fundamental tenet of our case when it comes to erasing minority voices, right? Because one of the things my partner brings to you is the idea that distinguished minority individuals use their platform to bring forth a narrative that is otherwise not heard, right? We bring to you the idea that the average or common individual, by definition, is never going to be a minority. They're going to be in a statistical majority. And so so when we have people who are trying to get their voice and their platform heard, they are going to be at a disadvantage when we're centering narratives around specific individuals. Because of this, we believe that the ability to choose certain individuals to platform and actually get your story out there is critical to minorities actually gaining some kind of solvency when it comes to their issues. We identify, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and it's brought to you the idea that we shouldn't venerate this individual, which one, my partner brings to the idea that veneration is not inherent to focusing on these individuals. We don't have to worship or place everything they do on a pedestal. When we're examining them, we have the ability to critique them. I think we all agree that we all know who Hitler is. We talk about Hitler a lot in the context of World War II, yet none of us really think Hitler is a swell guy that has been placed on a pedestal. But furthermore, we believe that it was actually very calculated and targeted decisions specific times in the civil rights movement. Look at the idea that the first individual to actually bust boycott, I'll take your point in just a second. The first individual to bust boycott was not Rosa Parks. However, she was a 15-year-old girl who was pregnant, and they knew that the optics of that situation would be used to delegitimize the morality of the minority actors and therefore delegitimize their movement. So instead, they got Rosa Parks, someone who would be viewed much more amicably by the average individual, to propagate that narrative, right? And that's a big point of our case today, which is the idea that being able to choose who is pushing your narrative when it comes to these minority voices is very, very important, because you're going to need people who are not going to be delegitimized to the same extent by the oppressive forces at play. Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, so on that, when we're talking about ordinary people, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're only going to talk about like the average person. It means when we talk about certain groups, the examples we use and the anecdotes aren't just going to be super important famous people.
Okay, so also I would like to kind of contest this idea about the structural framework of history in and of itself, right? Because sure, you could focus on the politicians or the elite part of this resolution. However, we believe that is not the only element of today's conversation. When we're looking at leaders, when we're looking at icons, that is where we're accessing most of the solvency here, because these individuals, again, these groups as a whole are being delegitimized in the context of their societies, and having an exceptional individual amongst their group doing the platforming and propagation of their narrative is very important to that. Sure, that's not as important to politicians specifically. However, we can recognize that defending the entire resolution, we have very clear grounds with that in today's debate, right? Another thing we'd like to contest that the government bench brings to you is the idea that centering the narrative around the common man is going to inherently be a good thing. We see with targeted political ads and other such ventures that people will oftentimes pick, like hand pluck an anecdote that fits whatever narrative they want to push, and use that as the example of the average individual. They would push that. We see, like I said, I guess citing our best evidence right now is political ads and similar ventures where you have individuals who are going to take, this small-time farmer who's supposed to represent your every American, your every man, and push forward the narrative that everyone who is average aligns with them, which also feeds into our critique of their point in and of itself, of the idea that I can find an anecdote to represent the same thing, right? We recognize that this is actually on the grounds of our side of the house. Why is this? This is because when to the point where you have these narratives coming from average individuals that are then used to create some sort of martyr or create some kind of an icon within the context of that movement, that is an individual that would be in this context. We would say wholeheartedly that is our grounds of the house to say that Emmett Till and his murder was iconic and was the type of individual that studying would be on our side of the grounds of the house, right? We recognize that these narratives coming from certain individuals and being boosted to the platform of martyrdom are no longer in their side of the house, so they can't claim that solvency because that is falling into our side of the house. Those individuals are iconic in the context of their movements, in the context of the groups that they're a part of, and they are used to push forward the story and the narrative that those groups want to see represented. While I can, I'll still take that point from opening.
So for example, the Hong Kong protesters didn't need a figurehead for the Hong Kong protest to be successful. Why then, on your side of the house, do you paint it as we need figureheads in order to have like some level of minority assent, to have some level of movement assent?
We do not paint the idea that we need to have, these leaders or figureheads for the sake of minorities. What we are saying is that it is a clear and targeted way that those individuals use or try to navigate the oppression that they face, and it is a very helpful tool. Once to take that tool away from them is delegitimizing and silencing their voices. We are not saying that every person in our society needs this. We are saying that the people who need it the most will be delegitimized on your side of the house. But moving forward from there, we just bring to the general idea that contextualizing history is important, right? And so to the point where we acknowledge functionally, there's only so many people you can put in a textbook. There's only so many narratives you can push in any given class. There's only so much you can cover in a limited amount of time. We recognize that accessing these individuals who have the greatest sway, who present the greatest context, and who you know, had, like we just said, disproportionate effect on the events that took place, is going to give the greatest amount of context to the most amount of individuals. Our point is not on our side of the house that talking about these individuals can be the whole story. We're saying historically centering the narrative around these individuals, one, protects minority rights and people who need to have access to martyrdom and image control when it comes to pushing for their narrative and getting it to a greater platform. But two, we also bring to the idea that one really shouldn't get lost in the pedantics, and this is supposed to start a conversation. When we all know the story of Emmett Till, it starts a conversation about racial injustice. When we all know the story of certain persecuted individuals, we know to start looking into those issues. And that's really what we're trying to access on our side of the house, right? When you have these certain targeted individuals, we're seeing those individuals have the potential to spark conversations about what is going on. So in the interest of protecting the most disparaged individuals among us, and the interest of actually getting people to start conversations and learn more on historical context without necessarily venerating or idealizing everyone we examine, we wholeheartedly urge you cast your ballot in favor of the opposition bench.
Cool. Thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the member of government up to begin the back half of this debate.
Am I audible? Okay, I'll just take POIs in the chat. Just get my timer out, sorry. We're going to start off with just some rebuttal to the two arguments that we see coming out of the DLO. So first, to give this argument that we shouldn't get caught up in pedantics and that the point of history is to start like important conversations. We think the issue here is that they assume that like the impacts of ordinary people can't start conversations, and the actions I as a person take only have importance if I am like wealthy and have like a mirror on, like a spotlight on me, and I'm able to do important things. We think this is just simply not true. We think that like an average like a racist person who commits a lynching, for example, might have been like an ordinary person at one point, but they still created a very impactful like thing that can be talked about by other people. Like you don't have to be setting the policies in order to be like an impactful person, right? Like we think ordinary people are quite often impactful, and ordinary people like quite frankly matter in the course of history. Whereas this is true, you can still start conversations. Secondly, they tell us about like you need to set control narratives about martyrs. This is really important for minority movements. We think the issue here is a temporality thing, right? That like when we're talking about history, we're not saying that like when we have current politics like going on right now, that you can't have like martyrs and really important people. We're saying that in like 50 years, when we're talking about the events of today, we don't just talk about the martyrs. We focus mainly on like how the overall movement was representing the needs of people. We think this is really bad for their argument because it means that like current movements are still going to operate in pretty much the same way, because we think that history, like when it's looking at the past, is more recounting the events that happened, right? It's just about that. We also think that like important people are still mentioned, obviously. It's like we spend less time learning about like George Washington's teeth and instead learn about like an average person, what was actually affecting them on the day-to-day. Then going on to like what we think the real comparative is in today's debate, right? We think that like top half gets really, really muddled about like what history should look like and like what is more accurate history. We think that the biggest issue actually should be like the people who interact with history and how it encourages them to live their lives and who lives a better life. Like what type of history influences people to live better sorts of lives. Like whereas this is true, we think the average person probably isn't a historian. The average person probably only encounters history in like their 3rd grade or 5th grade class, takes it maybe throughout like whatever mandated education. And then after that probably engages very little with history overall. We think that these are the type of people we're going to be influencing most. Secondly, we think that all the issues like with history, like structural issues with history, probably still exist on either side of the house. That is to say, history is probably still racist. History probably still like glorifies war heroes. History probably still does on net bad things. What do we think the unique difference is? We think that when we're making the arguments that history is making now, we think history probably on net makes relatively the same arguments, right? We think that the evidence that you use, like the anecdotes you use, are going to be those of like ordinary people who like have examples that illustrated the general argument that is being made. We think this is on net better for two main reasons. First, we think it humanizes people. And secondly, we think it like on net convinces people that their individual actions matter. On the first point, in the status quo, we think that right now, the plight of minorities is like largely ignored, right? We think that like ordinary people, when they're talking about history, like sure, we probably talk about like slavery and civil rights, but we think that there's some issues with this, right? So first, we look at like overall historical events. Like when was the last time someone actually read like an account of like what an actual day in the life of a slave looked like, right? We think this is like very rare in current teachings because we're overall focused on talking about like large scale leaders instead of talking about like the actual horrors of what happened to minorities in the past. We think you create a much more compelling narrative when you're able to look at like individual details compared to just like general stories. And secondly, we think that that like minorities specifically are ignored for large swaths of time when there aren't like changes happening in like certain situations. When you talk about the ordinary person, this means that like when you're going through periods of history where maybe there weren't changes happening in the slave trade, for example, like 1820 to like 1850, right? Where sure, there was a growing abolition movement, but you get very few narratives about what was actually happening about slaves because we consider that like stagnant. We think you get more narratives about like what's occurring in the life of a slave at that particular time. That is to say that like slaves existed for hundreds of years, but we actually talk about it for a relatively small slice of the historical cave. We think that OO is probably going to say that like, oh yeah, but the ordinary, like the average person is probably not like a slave in the United States at this time. We push back against this. We think that history is like inherently segmented, right? We think that like, sure, we talk about like different groups at different times. In our side of the house, we don't think you just talk about like whoever the average person is. We think that's inaccurate history. And remember, we tell you that the overall arguments that history is making stay relatively the same. It's just how they build those arguments that we think uniquely changes. Why do we think it's really important to talk about like individual people? We think that it like humanizes minorities. We think there are two main groups we're talking about today. First, we're talking about like the impact it has directly on minorities who are now reading this history. And secondly, the impact it has on like non-minorities. We think it's good for both groups. First, on minorities. I think when you read about people who are like you and you are empowered, right? You're able to like listen to writings of like people in the civil rights movements. You're able to like look at ordinary people. We think when you're looking at like just leaders, you're precluded from this. Why? We think that leaders convince you that you have to be extraordinary to ever really relate. Like I can't relate to MLK because he's going to be far more articulate than I ever will, right? Whereas this is true, I'm not necessarily humanized by looking at MLK. What I am humanized is by looking at like other Black people like me who are able to actually make an impact and who are able to actually exist at this time frame. We think that I'm uniquely able to relate more to the ordinary person because I am ordinary and like MLK just by definition is not. He had more power than me and is like more influential than I ever will be. Secondly, we think it's like really important to understand the struggle of these groups, right? That like when I'm understanding like structural inequality, I'm able to understand historic oppression and whatnot. This counteracts like current narratives about systemic racism, that it's only in extreme cases. When I'm able to look at the racism that like a normal person goes through on the day-to-day, I'm able to understand it more. You don't need extremes to make the point of the argument. I'll take OO real quick.
Right. So it is the point of the opposition bench that you've identified, oh, I can't relate to Martin Luther King because he's inherently somehow fundamentally different than me. However, we say we gain pushback on this idea by destroying that narrative, by actually focusing on him, engaging with it, and not letting the only actual narrative of that individual come from their disproportionate sway in their time.
We think the issue here is when I focus on one person who is just like uniquely impactful, the odds I and most people become uniquely impactful is very, very low, right? I'm probably more likely to say like, oh, MLK did like amazing things, but the odds I can do amazing things are really low because factually that's just like how it works, right? We think that like I'm uniquely precluded from engaging with MLK because of that. So why do we think it's good for like people who are not minorities to interact with these narratives? And why do you think it's really important for people to think that history is watching them? We think one, for all the same reasons, when you're reading about minorities more, and you're reading about like average people you can relate to more, it's better. So we think for like an average white person, they're probably better able to relate to like an average like Black person going about their day in the civil rights movement than they are to relate to MLK, right? We think that when you see all the similarities that your life shares with like minorities and like ordinary people at that, you're able to like see them more as people. We think you'll on net get more liberal policy and more view of minorities as humans. And secondly, we think it's really important for people to believe that history is watching them. When I am able to read a history textbook, and I think there's more of a chance that my actions are going to end up in the textbook and judged by people going forward, we think this means I'm more likely to act good. We think it is less likely for me to be like, oh, I could do this bad thing because no one's ever going to care in the future, and no one's ever going to care ever about it or even know about it. We think that when history is watching people, it's able to act as like an eye and show people that there are consequences to their actions, right? I may be able to justify that like, oh, my individual actions don't really matter because it'll never be in a history textbook. History tells me that I'm going to have very little impact on the overall flow of things. We think when people believe in this, they just act better. We think on net, you get like more progressive policy on our side of the house and people are just get more agency and humanization. For these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Cool, thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the member of opposition up to begin the case for the closing opposition team.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, so I can't really see the chat. If you have a point, just like, wave and I'll address you. Cool. The top half of this debate was sprawling and messy. It got caught up in a lot of convoluted principles and impacts that at times were not linked back to the emotion or impacted out to explain why you should vote on one issue above the other. So at the end of the first half of this debate, we recognize that what was missing was an actual consistent way to weigh this round, right? They've refused to engage in actor analysis, and we recognize that the heart of this motion is to engage with how the education system operates, right? We have to analyze recognize the goals and function of the education systems, if we are to first engage on like a principled ideology, or rather a principled argument on how that system ought to operate and how things ought to be structured in that system, but then we also have to understand how the education system is best serving its purpose if we are to engage on a practical level, which is why side closing opposition is going to stand out in this debate, because we are going to engage on a principled and a practical analysis, something unique from both teams in the upper half, while also talking about how that operates within the goals of the education system. So on the first, some of the more detailed arguments from the first half, right? So opening government gives you two key contradictions that we're surprised opening opposition really didn't point out or capitalize on after I gave you that point of information. The first great contradiction comes from his Darian's characterizations of what exposure looks like. Their first prime minister tells you that exposure puts people on a pedestal, which makes them have no room for things like critiques, right? Okay, that's cool. I understood that. Even though like the link structure wasn't very strong and it was kind of weak in the sense that it didn't actually explain why that's innate to focusing on individuals. But second, we're going to argue, we're going to point out that like the second speech, the deputy prime minister pointed out how exposure tends to delegitimize people, for example, like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, right? So is there room for critiques or is there not room for critiques? And what is the link and mechanism that decides what movements are open to critiques and what movements are not open to critiques? We're not quite sure what opening government's world looks like. They kind of fall out of the debate at that point. But furthermore, this defensive argument when they try to combat opening opposition's argument by saying something like, we can read the recounts of slavery by either a slave owner or a slave themselves, and that's how we can kind of begin to critique slavery. That was a defensive argument. But then they bring you this argument about war heroes, where they tell you that for example, reading about war as a broader concept or focusing on icons of war kind of glorifies war as a whole. No, thank you. But also we recognize that this is non-unique to their own arguments, right? If we go on their own basis of logic, right? Focusing on the individual narratives that happen to people who go to war is still going to glorify war, which means that there's a really problematic contradiction for the opening government there. Moving on to the member of government speech, right? We think that government on the entirety bench is problematic because the anecdotes, for example, that the member government characterizes that they talk about slavery, those slaves were not able to read. They were not able to access things like literacy, which means that the recounts of their experiences are so very rare. But there were examples of when they actually did publish these recounts. And what happened? They became icons of the abolition movement. For example, Frederick Douglass, right? That's really, really important because focusing on that icon is an incredible way to actually understand what abolition looked like and how movements advance themselves. But also, we would point out that even if you don't buy any of that, member of government's arguments are predicated on the assumption that the neoliberal systems of education are going to select the narratives that they want to. For example, if we're talking about the Vietnam War, what is going to make the neoliberal whoever's in charge of the Department of Education say, we're going to talk about the victim of war and war crimes on behalf of America in Vietnam, instead of talking about, for example, like someone who was allied with the United States in the war of Vietnam. It's just going to lead to the same kind of characterizations that are persistent through the education system right now. So even if you buy that, they have no offense on that point. I'll go ahead and take a point from closing government.
Whereas we tell you that we think the narratives of history overall stay the same arguments are being made, but we'd rather people be able to think they are active agents in history rather than be precluded because they can't relate to important people. Can you just engage with that analysis?
Yeah, so this is what I was saying at the top of my speech. It's problematic that nobody engaged with an actor analysis because nobody actually knows who is selecting these narratives, right? So you're predicating all of your offense on an assumption that you can actually begin to talk about the narratives that you want to, when that's really not even warranted on your side of the house. But you could do that in your next speech. So on our first point, on the point of positive matter that we are bringing to you, we're going to take a step back and examine the principled and practical goals of the education system. First, we recognize that the kind of exposure that Darian explains to you is actually very principally valuable. We think there comes to analyze the forces of history that have pushed our society to be the way it is now. For example, Susan B. Anthony, analyzing some of the classism that is innate in her idea of feminism, but also focusing on the really great things that she did. That is unique because we can already start to see what is just and what is unjust in the conceptions of that individual. We think there's plenty of room for critiques. We see that all throughout our history textbooks, even though they're not necessarily to the point where they should be, but that's non-unique on their side of the house as well. And second, we also recognize recognize that we can have a fuller understanding, which is kind of like the practical argument that we are positing to you right here. We recognize that the practical goals of the education system ought to be to equip students with experience and knowledge necessary to make history, right? We posit to you that centering power structure, that rather centering around like the politicians and like figures that have driven history and like started these movements and have like had a significant impact on the world around us, allows us to not only engage with like the what of history, like the anecdotal kind of analysis that like Darian argues is like what the education system ought to look like, but we're also going to examine like why. So for example, let's return back to that like Vietnam War argument, example, right? So reading the diary of a refugee from Vietnam doesn't necessarily answer the broader questions of why the war in Vietnam happened. Whereas looking at something like Henry Kissinger's interaction with, like, for example, the Russian president or like different world leaders at the time might actually begin to answer some of those why questions. And that's really important because we can begin to understand exactly why the world why the world operates the way it does now. And then we can also begin to fight back against those mechanisms used by belligerent people in power. And second, we also recognize that there's a unique argument or unique benefit to having people who are put as role models, right? For example, I didn't know it was realistically possible for queer people to have access to public office until I learned about the examples of stories of people like Harvey Milk, who won elected office and was a queer icon, right? We think that having that kind of focus on him is a unique benefit, not only to like the education system, but to the student as well, because it encourages and empowers them to find their own agency through a system, through a form of education that allows them to look at people like them who actually acquired power. So proud to oppose this motion.
Cool, thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the government whip up to close out the government side of this debate here. Side note, also, please don't put anything other than just POI something in the chat. Just have it be, that's totally fine. This world works. So cool, but Gov whip whenever you're ready. Cool.
For me, POI is typing in the chat. I think that'll be easiest for me to see him. All right, with that, let's get time started. All right. I think what Nick, like sort of the structure that Nick gives you to weigh this round, like we think is crucial, is that the studying of history isn't just like for historians, isn't just like people trying to understand like exactly what happened or the exact facts. The reason we study history is to make people better citizens and to make people be like more willing to go out and like do things that are like correct in their life. Why do we think like almost all of opening half sort of misses the point here? We think they get way too bogged down in sort of like this principal idea of the fact that like we owe historical figures or individuals whole, like giving their lives credit. Like, I don't think anyone who is dead really cares like how you remember them, right? What we think the actual point of history is to motivate people to make better decisions and to give them the facts to view the world in an accurate way. Why do we think side government does that? So first off, I'm going to sort of get into what OO talks about, talk about what we better solve back for his framing mechanism, we build our case, and then weigh up the issues. So what does CO tell you, right? We sort of get one point that directly clashes with our argument. What they say is that they agree. They think the point of history is to make people like better, is to make people like better human beings. But what they say is like the way that what they tell you is that like the way that they are going to do that is by looking at historical figures, right? What they say is examining individuals is like really crucial because that gives you like someone you can aspire to see. So the issue that Nick brings up, which we don't really think they respond to, is that it's just so much easier to relate to like an average individual who is making some change in their community than it is like the one individual out of an entire group that was able to like aspire to some like high standing position, right? We think it is most individuals recognize that they will not become senators, that they will not become leaders of a like massive social movement, right? What we think is important is instead to show them that they can still like enact a form of change in their local communities. That's what Nick tells you in his speech. Yeah, I'll take your point now.
Right, so we would argue. Sorry.
I was taking opening, sorry.
Okay, so you just identified the idea that people wouldn't actually be caring about the minutiae or the exact specific details. And the point of history is to kind of affect how people live their lives. But you also identified the idea that somehow contextualize and focus on these narratives and the exact details of people's lives will make them be better people because they're afraid of like future people scrutinizing their actions. This is kind of a contradiction.
I missed the very last part there, but here, what we are saying is that the purpose of history is to like make people's actions change. We think the best way to do that, right, isn't to focus on a couple of big leaders and the policies they pursued. It's rather to focus on individuals and like what they did in their lives, right? So look, and I think like part of this, which we're going to get to in a second, is like we don't think on either side of the house. And I think this has sort of been like missed by every team this round. We don't think on either side of the house that like the history you are actually talking about changes, right? This gets into what closing opposition says on our case with this Vietnam War example. They say like they're not going to understand. I'm not going to take any more points in the speech. They say that they're not like we're just going to focus on like the wrong side of the Vietnam War, right? But they don't give us like any sort of like comparative, right? That is already what we do in the status quo. Nick tells you at the very top of his speech, right? We think that regardless of which side you're on, history is still going to be fraught with issues, right? There's still going to be like large like racial issues, like house history studied, like a lot of like looking over like minute details and facts. But what we say is we would rather have you focus on individual histories. Like, why is that, right? What we tell you is like two key reasons. One is like the impact on like minorities and like how they are going to view history, right? What we tell you is that you would rather be able to read about like someone's life who is like an average citizen, like see how they were able to enact change than like Martin Luther King's life, right? We think most people recognize they're not going to be like the next Martin Luther King, but we think it is far more empowering to see how some like very localized civil rights leader was able to go out and make a difference and protest, right? We think that is far more like motivating for people right now to feel like they can make a difference as well in like the current Black Lives Matter movement than like truly believing they're going to like be the leader of that movement. How does closing opposition respond, right? They give you one response, like specifically on slavery, they say like slaves couldn't write. Well, what we tell you is that like we'd say one, like there have been lots of historians who focus on like reconstructing the lives of slaves. So even if they themselves couldn't write, we don't think it has to be a primary source to study someone's life, right? We think historians have like done some work reconstructing the lives of slaves, whether they wrote things or not. We think that is still a very fair way to focus on their lives. Like no one modeled in, it has to be a primary source. And second, what we would say is that like they literally give like one example of what like a time period they couldn't write. We think like again there are lots of other examples of like periods of time like one isn't a primary source, and two we think that they're like for the last about 100 or so years we think like the primary sources do exist. We think like at best they get like very minimal mitigation. And then on the second issue, which they just like don't respond to, is like understanding the struggle, right? We think that like here is what is like going to change in this world. We think that like in either world history is discussed, right? We think that like history of all events is that we're going to give the same amount of weight to slavery as is given now. But what changes is for a like non-minority studying history. What we say is it is easier to understand struggle and oppression when you're looking at the day-to-day struggles of a slave. This is to understand the institution or like economics of slavery as it is studied now. Why do we think this is very crucial to enacting long-term policy change, which we think is going to be like by far and away the biggest impact in today's round? What we tell you is that understanding the day-to-day struggle of like how systems of oppression and racism actually factor into people's lives, and not just that like in general slavery was bad and that it happened, makes people better understand like how these systems of oppression continue into the modern world, right? We say it humanizes minorities more and makes like non-minority members like better able to understand their struggle. Why do we think this is important, right? One, we think it rejects like existing narratives like racism doesn't exist, it's a thing of the past, and like really it wasn't that bad to begin with. And it's like we reject those current narratives. But even if you believe that like any current racist person isn't going to change their views, we think like once you build an entire generation who has learned with these narratives rather than just like a general glossing over of like the fact that like these a couple of events happened, we think like that is going to counteract these narratives long term. And then the second reason we think we're winning today's debate is that we think like whether or not like there are individuals, like what we say is they're going to weigh like you're happier when there are individuals who you can relate to. Like we think that is like very crucial to individuals going to like be able to enact change, right? What we are saying is like when there are people that you can actually relate with in history, like that's incredibly important. We think that like being able to see someone who is enacting like change, who is like relatable to you, has a like similar lifestyle to you, is going to like lead to far more change in the present than like just looking at a couple of key figures in society. For that reason, we are very proud to propose.
Cool, thank you so much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the opposition whip up to end this debate. Here.
All right, can everyone hear me? Just a thumbs up. Okay, and I'll be taking POIs if you like show me. I'm not really gonna be looking at the chat, so just make it visual. Okay, so if everyone's ready, I'll go ahead and begin my time now. So just going to be summarizing the top half of the debate into one question, which is essentially just comes down to like, is exposure to immorals actors good or bad? So in opening government, they would tell you that like by kind of like exposing immoral actors in the past, this puts people on a pedestal. But as Hans recognizes in his speech, they have a key contradiction here. They say that first it's going to put people on a pedestal, but that secondly, like this pedestal delegitimizes like these very movements. So not really sure where to go with here, but we'll just go ahead and assume what they say in their first speech, that it like puts people on a pedestal and this is bad. However, look to the fact that this is non-unique, right? Countries paint out narratives in their own world too, but there's nothing to say that in their world they actually solve. They say that all of a sudden we're going to have all these more stories, more quantity goes up, but they don't necessarily solve for the quality going up, especially because they observe that the actor in this case is still the educational systems and still the people that are acting in the status quo to actively oppress people. So there's no solvency on the opening gov side there. So OO would win the top half of the debate. But even then, OO has this whole idea of like context, right? They like bring up this whole idea of like context and how people like have much more capital over others to kind of make others more likely to listen to them. And this is like a really good starting point, but they don't really further it. And you're going to be voting on closing opposition today because we further this narrative. In our speech, Hans tells you like the specific uniqueness of the actor analysis. He tells you that like in the top half of the debate, they don't really talk about like the actor in this resolution or who's going to be like implementing this policy or like how this like policy is going to be kind of like affected by the people that we're looking at in history. And he tells you that because there's no analysis in this, like it doesn't really matter, like top half of the debate doesn't win and you're going to look toward bottom half because we give you the analysis. We tell you that there's two things that make looking at the individual, whether it be like politicians or leaders or icons, specifically unique. First, we tell you that explains the what if history. It explains the facts, right? And sure, maybe government can have that in their role too, but what like both government teams lack is the why of history. By just looking at like a blanket generalization of like the entire broad situation, there's like people that are like learning about history aren't able to connect to it, right? Because like it's a lot harder to, because it's just like these broad generalizations that don't make it easy. Take for example, me being a female and me delving into the example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If I just learn about like the feminism movement as a whole without any faces to it, it doesn't really mean that much to me, right? But when I look specifically at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an individual who went to an Ivy League school as a female and who graduated and went to law school and became the first female Supreme Court justice, I can see her narrative follow specifically down the line of somewhere that I want to go. But if I just look at feminism in general, I'm not able to draw those realizations and I'm not able to figure out specifically how to overcome these certain power dynamics and if it's even possible to overcome these certain power dynamics in the first place. But before I move on, I'll go ahead and take a POI. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. A little bit. Can you speak louder?
Yeah, I said you're taking the POI from top half or back half. Sorry.
I'll take them back half.
Okay. So at the point where like most individuals are not going to Ivy League schools and most individuals recognize they will never go to Ivy League schools. And second, like your characterization feminist movement, like we think isn't our side of the house, right? It's not looking at the movement as a whole. It's looking at like random individual women who are part of that movement, but like aren't those at the very top. Like, why do you not say that those are who it is easier to relate with than like the very pinnacle like of achievement in that movement, Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Okay, I'm just saying like Ruth Bader Ginsburg as an example, right? Like obviously not every single person is going to go to an Ivy League school, but if I don't get that narrative, then I don't get that same impact. I'm not able to see an example in which someone overcomes a barrier and in which they actually use that barrier to their advantage and to make change. Because in your side of the house, in your world, there's no actually personalization, right? And your entire argument is predicated on this idea that like people can't relate to these stories, right? But I would argue that that actually turns itself on its side and goes to our side because like in your world, you don't solve for this relationship. How does just all of a sudden a generalization and like a broad story all of a sudden make something more appealing to an individual? We would argue that it doesn't because it lacks that why of history, right? It lacks like the actual examples and the mechanisms in which people can start to kind of like do an analysis of an individual story and kind of figure out why things happened. But this could even be extended further, right? Look to how we can take like someone's like personal experience or someone's like like politics and how we can use it to kind of predict the trends of history. Look to how like Mao's goals are extremely important to understanding the goals of China, not only in the status quo and not only historically, but also so that we can start to predict what those goals and what those trends are going to look like in the future, right? You can also expand this to like the United States, like look at Trump, right? Like, right, like maybe we're not going to be like analyzing, like doing analysis on Trump's like policies right now, but we say that like in the future when we're trying to understand like maybe how a pandemic killed 200,000 people, or why the United States was so terrible in our response, or why all of these bad things have been happening in the United States right now, we're going to say, why did this happen? And we can't look back to a general like broad narrative because we're not going to get an answer there. We have to look back to specific individuals that are in these like power making and like high positions of power that can actually have influence. So we would say that like in the future, if we want to understand some of these things, it's really important to also look back on the individual level. That's not to say that we completely get rid of the broad context, but we say that we prioritize the people that are in power and the context. But before I move on, sure, I'll go ahead and take a quick question from OG.
The problem with closing is that they entirely fail to engage with the true comparative that they're forced to here. We are not talking about broad versus individualized history. We're talking about individuals as ordinary people or individuals as the elite. We give you concrete analysis on this.
Okay, but we would say that if you're trying to solve for elite and like this domination of narrative, this is where you're going to vote for closing opposition. And this is where my main analysis is going to come in. We tell you that as people we give you the two mechanisms of what an education system should do. This goes unaddressed, but first we tell you that it should help people understand the past and maybe to help people like predict trends of the future. But secondly, this also goes uncontested. We tell you that education is in the unique position to equip students with knowledge and power to make their own history. So at the end of the day, we would say that like government and opposition have like the same goal of like defying counter narratives and helping people like, you know, have like more relatable things with history and to kind of like take it with their own thing and make own history. But how does that happen? And we tell you that in our world, we do that through agency. We give you a specific mechanism. We tell you that by looking at the individual story, by looking on the individual level, we can start to identify people who maybe look like that, look like us, act like us, come from the same backgrounds as us, experience the same trauma and hardships as us. And that in and of itself is empowering to see that individuals are like you and that if they can overcome it, then so can you. And that doesn't happen in the government world. So proud to oppose.